Did you know that one of Hollywood's most glamorous actresses designed a secret communication system to help the war effort? Or that the man behind Mickey Mouse turned his studio into a factory for military training films? The story of the entertainment industry during the Second World War isn't just about famous faces in uniform. It's a story of total mobilization. Every part of the Hollywood machine, from the sound stages to the animators' desks to the stars themselves, was retooled for a single purpose. How did they do it? How did an industry built on fantasy become a vital part of a global reality? What happens when the people who create dreams are asked to help win a war? Number 21, could a movie ticket bolster an alliance? Yes, it could. And it did. The American government knew the war wasn't just being fought on battlefields. It was also a war of ideas, of hearts and minds. They needed to convince the world, especially neutral or wavering countries, that the Allied cause was the right one. Hollywood films became a powerful tool for this. They were a form of cultural diplomacy long before the term was common. The Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, or OSIA, was an agency created in 1940. It was led by Nelson Rockefeller. Its main job was to counter enemy influence in Latin America. The German regime was making strong inroads there with its own propaganda films. The OSIA realized that American movies, which were already popular, could be a perfect countermeasure. They didn't just want to send any movie, though. They wanted films that showed a positive, democratic, and friendly United States. So the OSIA worked directly with the studios. They encouraged the production of good neighbor films. These movies often featured Latin American settings, stars, and themes. Think of films like Disney's Saludos Amigos from 1942 and The Three Caballeros from 1944. These animated features weren't just cartoons. They were diplomatic missions. Walt Disney and his artists were sent on a goodwill tour of South America by the State Department. The films that resulted were a celebration of Latin American culture, presented through a friendly American lens. They were hugely popular and helped build cultural bridges. It wasn't just animation. Major studios produced features with Latin American stars like Carmen Miranda and Cesar Romero. In films like Down Argentine Way, 1940, or Weekend in Havana, 1941 were colorful musicals. They presented a fun, vibrant, and non-threatening version of American culture. The government didn't always have to force the issue. The studios saw a huge market in Latin America, especially since the European market was closed off by the war. The OSIA simply guided them, offering research, suggesting themes, and sometimes providing financial incentives. According to scholar Thomas Schatz in his book Boom and Bust American Cinema in the 1940s, this collaboration was so effective that by 1945, American films dominated Latin American screens, pushing out European competitors. The strategy extended beyond the Americas. In neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland, American films were carefully selected and distributed. A movie like Mars Miniver, which showed the quiet courage of British civilians, was a powerful piece of pro-Allied messaging. It didn't need to be a combat film. It just needed to show the humanity and resilience of the people fighting against the Axis powers. Every ticket sold was a small victory in the global war for public opinion. But what parts of this cultural diplomacy were accidental? Were there films intended for domestic audiences that had a massive unforeseen impact in a neutral country, changing its public opinion overnight? How did enemy censors in occupied territories decide which American films were safe to show? And did they ever miscalculate, allowing a seemingly innocent film to inspire hope or resistance? And how many foreign policy decisions were subtly influenced not by a diplomat's speech, but by a Hollywood movie seen by a key political figure in a private screening? Number 20, how could a movie set double as a military base? When the war started, the United States needed space. It needed space for training, for storing equipment, for housing personnel, and it needed it fast. It turned out that Hollywood had exactly what the military was looking for. The major movie studios owned vast backlots. These were sprawling acres of land filled with standing sets, large empty sound stages, and skilled technicians. The government quickly realized this resource, so a unique partnership was formed. Studio lots, places designed for creating fantasy, became functional military installations. For example, the Hal Roach Studios, famous for Laurel and Hardy comedies, was turned over entirely to the U.S. Army Air Forces. It was officially renamed Fort Roach. The Army used its sound stages to produce training films. Comedians and movie stars found themselves working alongside soldiers on the same lot where they used to film slapstick routines. 20th Century Fox turned over a significant portion of its huge West Los Angeles backlot to the military for use as a supply depot and barracks. Warner Bros. Did the same. These lots were ideal. They were already fenced and secure. They had large windowless buildings, sound stages perfect for sensitive work or storage. They had workshops filled with carpenters, electricians, and engineers who could build or fix almost anything. These were the same people who built ancient Rome one day and a futuristic city the next. Building a barracks or a mock-up of an enemy village for training was easy for them. The first motion picture unit of the Army Air Forces, which we will discuss more, was headquartered at the Hal Roach Studios. This unit, staffed with Hollywood professionals, was responsible for producing more than 400 training and morale films. The actor Ronald Reagan was an officer in this unit. He never saw overseas combat, but he worked every day at Fort Roach, helping to create the films that would train the pilots and gunners who did. This repurposing went beyond just land. Studio resources were also used. The research departments of studios like MGM, which had massive libraries for checking historical accuracy in films, were used by military intelligence. They had detailed maps, photographs, and books about foreign countries that were invaluable for planning. A researcher who one week was checking the type of buttons on a Napoleonic uniform might the next week be asked to find photos of a specific bridge in France. The book, The Hollywood Canteen, by Lisa Mitchell and Bruce Torrance, touches on how every aspect of the industry was integrated into the war effort, including the physical space itself. The line between making a movie and supporting the military became very, very blurry, but what secret military projects were developed on these lots hidden in plain sight behind the facade of a movie studio? Were there sound stages used for top secret intelligence briefings or for developing new kinds of camouflage tested right there on the backlot? How many soldiers quartered in makeshift barracks on a movie set wrote letters home describing the surreal experience of living inside a fantasy world while preparing for the harsh reality of war? We have the official records, but what were the unrecorded, informal uses of these spaces that have been lost to history? Number 19, could songwriters be soldiers? They could, but their weapons were melodies and lyrics. Music was everywhere during the war. It was on the radio, in movies, in jukeboxes at diners, and played by bands at USO dances. And a huge amount of that music came from Hollywood and its associated music industry, Tin Pan Alley. And the songs written during this period did more than just entertain. They shaped morale, explained national goals, and gave people a way to express their feelings of hope, fear, and patriotism. The government understood the power of a good song. The Office of War Information ODOI didn't directly commission a lot of music, but it did encourage songwriters to produce material that supported the war effort. And the songwriters of the era responded. Some songs were overtly patriotic, like Annie Bond's Today, written by Irving Berlin. It was a catchy tune commissioned by the Treasury Department to help sell war bonds. It was short, simple, and played constantly on the radio. Berlin, who also wrote God Bless America, donated all the royalties for these songs to public service organizations. Other songs focused on the human side of the conflict. I'll Be Seeing You, written by Sammy Fain and Irving Kahal, became an anthem for separated lovers. It spoke to the deep sense of longing and hope that millions of people felt. Frank Sinatra's recording of the song in 1944 became a massive hit. It wasn't propaganda, it was an honest expression of a shared emotion, and that made it incredibly powerful. It unified people in their shared experience of sacrifice. Hollywood musicals were a key vehicle for these songs. Judy Garland singing Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas in the 1944 film Meet Me in St. Louis was a moment of profound melancholy and hope. The song's lyrics, which originally were much darker, were changed at Garland's request to be more optimistic. The final version, with the line "Someday soon, we all will be together," perfectly captured the wartime mood. It acknowledged the sadness of the present, but offered a promise for the future. According to John Bush Jones in his book, The Songs That Fought the War, the music industry produced thousands of war-related songs. Some were silly and fun, designed to be a momentary escape like Rosie the Riveter. Others were serious and romantic. Together, they formed the soundtrack of the era. This music wasn't just background noise, it was an active part of the war effort. It gave soldiers a taste of home and gave civilians a way to feel connected to the troops. A song could travel anywhere, crossing oceans on radio waves and deliver a message of unity and resolve. But how many hit songs had lyrics that were secretly altered by government censors to be more patriotic or less defeatist? Were there popular songwriters who privately disagreed with the war but wrote patriotic anthems because of studio pressure or fear of being blacklisted? We know about the famous songs, but what about the protest songs that were written but never recorded, their lyrics and melodies now lost forever? What melodies were hummed in secret by resistance fighters in Europe, having been learned from a single radio broadcast? Number 18, can you fight a war with a drawing board? For Walt Disney and other animators, the answer was a definite yes. When the United States entered the war, the Disney studio was in a tough spot financially. The European market, a huge source of their income, was gone, but the government soon came calling with a new and vital customer, the U.S. military. Almost overnight, the Walt Disney Studios transformed from a dream factory into a highly efficient production house for military and government films. The numbers are staggering. According to a report by the studio itself, during the war, over 90% of its output was for government and military contracts. The studio produced an estimated 400,000 feet of film for the war effort. That's more than 68 hours of content. This wasn't just Mickey Mouse in a helmet, this was sophisticated, essential material. Disney's team of artists was uniquely skilled at explaining complex ideas in a simple, visual way. This made them perfect for creating training films. They made films for the Navy on topics like aircraft carrier, takeoff procedures, naval navigation, and how to identify enemy planes. For example, the Stop That Tank film, commissioned by the Canadian government, used animation to teach soldiers how to use an anti-tank rifle effectively. The animated format could show cutaways of the weapon, the trajectory of the shell, and the weak points on a tank in a way that live-action footage never could. One of the most famous pieces of this era was the 1943 feature film Victory Through Air Power. Based on a book by Major Alexander P. de Seversky, the film was a powerful piece of advocacy. It used animation to argue that long-range strategic bombing could win the war. It was a controversial idea at the time. The film was seen by President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Many historians, including James P. Baxter III in his official history, scientists against time, believe the film played a role in influencing their strategic thinking about the air war. Disney funded much of this film himself because he believed so strongly in its message. Beyond training and strategy, animation was used for pure propaganda. The short To Fear His Face, released in 1943, starred Donald Duck. It depicted him living in a nightmarish version of the enemy country, forced to work in a munitions factory. The short was a hilarious but biting satire of life under the enemy regime. It won the Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film that year. It was a way to dehumanize the enemy and rally support on the home front through laughter. Other studios like Warner Brothers with Bugs Bunny and Popeye from Fleischer Studios also produced similar cartoons. But what classified information was casually embedded in these training films, visible only to those with the proper clearance? How many animators, skilled in caricature, were secretly tasked with creating psychological profiles or even wanted posters based on fuzzy intelligence photos? Were there hidden messages or codes embedded in any of the propaganda shorts, meant to be seen by agents operating behind enemy lines? What happened to the hundreds of hours of animated footage that was deemed too secret or too sensitive to ever be released? And does it still exist in a forgotten vault? Number 17 was a movie star's most important role played off-screen. For many stars, the answer was yes. The war effort required a massive mobilization of the home front. People had to conserve resources, recycle materials, and buy war bonds. The government needed a way to convince millions of Americans to change their daily habits. They turned to Hollywood's most trusted faces. Movie stars became the salespeople for sacrifice. One of the most visible efforts was the promotion of scrap drives. The war machine needed vast quantities of metal, rubber, and other raw materials. The government launched nationwide campaigns encouraging citizens to collect and donate anything they could. To promote these drives, Hollywood stars were front and center. Actress Rita Hayworth famously donated the bumpers from her car. She was photographed doing it, and the pictures ran in newspapers and magazines across the country. It was a powerful symbol. If a glamorous movie star could give up a piece of her car, then surely ordinary citizens could donate an old pan or a broken bicycle. Bette Davis was a leader in organizing these efforts. She helped create and run the Hollywood Victory Committee, which coordinated the industry's war activities. She also spearheaded a campaign to sell war bonds. She set up a booth on Sunset Boulevard and used her star power to personally sell millions of dollars worth of bonds. Her efforts were relentless. The campaign to get people to conserve resources was also star-studded. The government promoted Victory Gardens, urging people to grow their own food to ease the strain on the national food supply. Photos of stars like Spencer Tracy or Katharine Hepburn tending their gardens were common. Rationing of things like gasoline, sugar, and meat was a part of daily life. The Office of Price Administration, the agency in charge of rationing, used movie stars in advertisements to explain why rationing was necessary and patriotic. A short film might feature a popular actor explaining how saving a little bit of gas helps fuel a tank on the front line. This use of celebrity was strategic. In the 1940s, movie stars were among the most admired and trusted people in America. As historian Mark Harris notes in Five Came Back, A Story of Hollywood and the Second World War, the government understood that a message delivered by Clark Gable had more impact than one delivered by a politician. The stars weren't just entertainers, they were role models. Their participation made these home front activities seem glamorous, important, and part of a unified national effort. They made sacrifice feel like a shared patriotic duty. But how much of this was genuine belief versus studio-mandated publicity? Did any stars secretly resent being used as props for government campaigns, and is there any record of their private complaints? What was the black market value of a ration book that was accidentally dropped by a major celebrity? And were there scrap drives that collected materials for secret experimental weapons, with the public being told the metal was for something mundane like tanks or ships? Number 16, could a movie convince a woman to build a bomber? It absolutely could. One of the biggest challenges the United States faced during the war was a massive labor shortage. Millions of men were enlisting in the military, leaving their jobs in factories and farms empty. The country needed to keep its industrial production running at full speed to supply the war effort. The solution was to call upon a new workforce, women. Hollywood played a critical role in this social and economic shift. The government, through the Office of War Information OWI, launched a campaign to recruit women into the workforce. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter came from this campaign. But before that poster became famous, movies were already planting the seed. Films started to feature strong, capable female characters who were actively contributing to the war effort. These weren't just nurses or volunteers, they were factory workers, welders, and engineers. A film like Swing Shift Maisie, 1943, part of a popular series starring Ann Sothern, showed the main character getting a job in an aircraft factory. The movie portrayed the work as patriotic and even glamorous. It showed women finding a new sense of purpose and camaraderie on the assembly line. The OWI worked with studios to ensure these messages were included in films. They provided a manual, the Government Information Manual for the Motion Picture Industry, which suggested themes and plot lines. It encouraged filmmakers to show women in non-traditional jobs and to portray their work as vital to winning the war. According to scholars, Clayton R. Kappas and Gregory D. Black, in their definitive book, Hollywood Goes to War, the OWI reviewed hundreds of scripts. They would suggest adding a scene where a female character decides to get a factory job, or changing a line of dialogue to emphasize the importance of women's labor. These movies did two things. First, they normalized the idea of women working in heavy industry. Seeing glamorous stars like Claudette Colbert or Veronica Lake portray factory workers made the idea more appealing and socially acceptable. Second, they provided a patriotic motivation. The films constantly linked the work on the home front to the fighting overseas. A woman wasn't just drilling rivets. She was helping her husband, brother, or son win the war and come home safely. The numbers show the campaign worked. Between 1940 and 1945, the female percentage of the U.S. workforce increased from 27% to nearly 37%. By 1945, nearly 1 out of every 4 married women was working outside the home. But what was the real-life culture clash like in factories where women started working alongside men for the first time? And did any films dare to show the tensions instead of the idealized camaraderie? Were there scripts that were rejected by the OWI because they showed female workers questioning their roles or demanding equal pay too forcefully? How many women made the life-changing decision to get a factory job based on a single powerful scene they saw in a movie theater on a Saturday afternoon? And what happened to the propaganda films aimed at convincing women to leave the workforce once the men returned home? Number 15, what does a place for a free cup of coffee and a dance mean in wartime? It meant everything. For a soldier or sailor on leave, often young, lonely, and far from home, a place of welcome could be a lifeline. The Hollywood Canteen was one such place. It was more than just a club, it was a symbol of Hollywood's commitment to the servicemen. It was an idea conceived by actor John Garfield and driven into reality by Bette Davis. The canteen opened its doors on October 3rd, 1942, in a converted barn off Sunset Boulevard. The rules were simple. Admission was free to any serviceman or woman in uniform from the Allied countries. Inside, they could get food, drinks, non-alcoholic, and entertainment, all for free. And the entertainment was A-list. On any given night, a soldier might be served a sandwich by Marlene Dietrich, have his coffee poured by Bob Hope, or dance with Hedy Lamarr. The stars weren't just performers on a stage, they were the staff. They, washed dishes, bussed tables, and spent time talking to the troops. This was the magic of the Hollywood Canteen. It broke down the barriers between the famous and the ordinary. For a few hours, a young private from a small town in Iowa could interact with the biggest stars in the world as equals. It was an incredible morale booster. It made the soldiers feel seen, appreciated, and valued. The canteen was a reminder of what they were fighting for: a democratic, friendly, and slightly glamorous America. The entire operation was run by volunteers from the entertainment industry. Over 3,000 stars, directors, agents, writers, and technicians volunteered their time. The guilds and unions of Hollywood all pitched in. The book Hollywood Canteen, The Great Second World War Entertainment Mecca, details how this massive undertaking was managed entirely by volunteers and donations. The canteen hosted millions of servicemen during its 3 years of operation from 1942 to 1945. It also served a propaganda purpose. Newsreels and radio broadcasts from the canteen were sent around the world. They showed a unified Hollywood with its biggest names working together to support the troops. This projected an image of a confident and united America. The canteen was so famous that in 1944, Warner Bros. Released a movie called Hollywood Canteen. It featured dozens of stars appearing as themselves and told a fictional story about a soldier falling in love with a hostess there. The film was a huge box office success and served as a fundraiser for the actual canteen. A similar institution, the Stage Door Canteen, did the same thing in New York City for the Broadway community. But what deeply personal or politically sensitive information was shared by soldiers to stars they trusted in the relaxed atmosphere of the canteen, and did any of that information make its way to intelligence agencies? Were there rivalries or conflicts between the stars as they worked side by side, hidden behind the smiles for the cameras? How many lifelong friendships or even marriages resulted from a chance dance between a soldier and a young starlet volunteering as a hostess? And what notes, scribbled on napkins and then forgotten, were left behind by soldiers who would never return? Number 14, how do you train millions of people for a global war? You use the best teachers you can find. And in the 1940s, some of the best teachers of visual information were working in Hollywood. The U.S. military faced a monumental task. It had to take millions of civilians and quickly train them to be soldiers, pilots, mechanics, and navigators. Traditional training methods were too slow. They needed a way to standardize instruction and deliver it efficiently. The answer was film. The military enlisted Hollywood's top talent to create thousands of training films. This effort was spearheaded by units like the Army's Signal Corps and the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics. But the most famous was the first motion picture unit of the Army Air Forces, mentioned earlier. This unit was a unique entity staffed almost entirely by film industry professionals who had enlisted. It was commanded by Jack L. Warner, the head of Warner Bros. Its members included directors, cinematographers, screenwriters, animators, and actors like Clark Gable, William Holden, and Ronald Reagan. These weren't dull, static lectures on film. They were sophisticated productions that used all the tricks of Hollywood storytelling. A film about how to maintain an aircraft engine might be structured like a mystery, with a mechanic trying to find the source of a problem. A film about aerial gunnery would use dramatic camera angles and fast-paced editing to simulate the feel of combat. As detailed in the catalog of information for U.S. Army motion pictures and film strips, these films covered every conceivable topic, from military courtesy and hygiene to complex bomb sighting systems and the identification of enemy aircraft. The use of animation, particularly from the Disney studio, was revolutionary. It could show the invisible, like the flow of electricity in a circuit or the physics of aerodynamics. This made abstract concepts easy to understand for recruits who may have had limited formal education. The impact of these films was enormous. They allowed the military to provide consistent, high-quality training to a vast number of people at once. A single film could be duplicated and sent to every training base in the country. This ensured that every pilot, no matter where they were trained, learned the same procedures. It saved time, resources, and ultimately lives. Men who had never seen an airplane before could learn the basics of its operation from a film before they ever stepped into a cockpit. It was a mass production approach to education, and it was powered by Hollywood's expertise. But what advanced, top-secret military technology was first revealed to soldiers through these classified training films, years before the public knew of its existence. Were there mistakes or inaccuracies in some early films that led to tragic accidents, with the evidence later covered up? How many Hollywood professionals working on these films came up with innovative military tactics or equipment modifications that were then adopted by the armed forces? And what happened to the outtakes and unused footage from these thousands of films, which might offer a candid, unscripted look at the wartime military? Number 13, could a voice on the radio reach across an ocean? It could, and it was a crucial link between the front lines and the home front. During the war, radio was the dominant mass medium. Almost every American family had a radio in their living room. It was their primary source for news, entertainment, and a sense of connection to the wider world. And Hollywood stars and the entire entertainment industry were at the heart of this connection. The Armed Forces Radio Service, AFRS, was created in 1942. Its mission was to provide radio programming for troops serving overseas. The AFRS didn't create all its own shows. Instead, it often took the most popular shows from the domestic networks, removed the commercials, and pressed them onto transcription discs. These discs were then shipped to military bases all over the world. A soldier in the Pacific could listen to the same comedy show by Jack Benny or Bob Hope that his family was hearing back home. This was a powerful link, a shared experience that helped combat the intense feelings of isolation and homesickness. And Hollywood stars also created original content specifically for the offers. Shows like Command Performance were produced by and for the military. The premise was that any soldier could write in and command any star to perform anything they wanted. This led to unique and often humorous pairings, like having a famous dramatic actor sing a silly song. The show was a massive hit with the troops. It gave them a sense of control and showed that the biggest stars in Hollywood were working for them. Beyond entertainment, radio was a vital tool for information and propaganda. The Office of War Information's radio division broadcast news and commentary around the world in multiple languages through its Voice of America service. Famous Hollywood directors like John Houseman produced these broadcasts. They were designed to provide reliable news to people in enemy and occupied territories, countering the propaganda of the Axis powers. At home, radio was used to support every aspect of the war effort. War bond appeals were a constant feature. The popular soap operas would weave in plot lines about rationing or a character getting a factory job. Kate Smith, a popular singer, became a legendary war bond salesperson through her marathon radio broadcasts. In one 18-hour broadcast, she reportedly raised over $39 million. This direct personal appeal through the airwaves was incredibly effective. As documented by Gert Horton in his book Radio Goes to War, radio created a sense of a national community, with everyone listening together and participating in a shared cause. But what coded messages were secretly embedded in AFR's broadcasts intended for intelligence operatives or resistance groups listening behind enemy lines? How many radio scripts were censored or rewritten by the government because their content was deemed too pessimistic or not sufficiently patriotic? Were there secret radio stations run by Hollywood expatriates in Europe broadcasting anti-Axis propaganda under the noses of the occupying forces? And what was the true emotional toll on radio stars who had to read cheerful, upbeat scripts right after receiving news that a friend or family member had been lost in the war? Number 12. Why would a movie studio care about a garden? Because a garden could produce more than just vegetables. It could produce morale. The Victory Garden movement was a nationwide campaign to encourage Americans to plant their own gardens. The logic was simple. The war required a massive amount of food to be shipped to troops overseas and to allies. This put a strain on the national food supply. If people could grow some of their own food, it would free up agricultural resources for the war effort. The Department of Agriculture estimated that by 1944, nearly 20 million Victory Gardens were producing about 8 million tons of food. This was roughly 40% of all the fresh fruits and vegetables consumed in the United States that year. It was a hugely successful program, and Hollywood was instrumental in making it happen. Movie studios and their stars became high-profile promoters of the movement. Walt Disney created a short film called Food Will Win the War, 1942, which explained the importance of farming and food production in a simple, engaging way. Whereas major studios planted their own Victory Gardens on their backlots, MGM, for example, tore up a field used for outdoor sets and planted a large garden. Photos of the garden with stars posing with shovels and hoes were sent to newspapers and magazines. These images were important. They made gardening seem patriotic and even a little glamorous. They showed that everyone, even the biggest movie stars, was doing their part. Popular actors were featured in newsreels and on posters offering gardening tips. A magazine might run a feature on Clark Gable's favorite type of tomato or Carole Lombard's technique for growing carrots. This was a soft form of propaganda, but it was highly effective. It used the power of celebrity to influence the behavior of millions of people. The campaign went beyond just planting. It was also about food preservation. The government encouraged people to can and preserve their harvest. Again, Hollywood helped get the message out. Women's magazines featured articles with actresses sharing their favorite canning recipes. Short films demonstrated proper canning techniques to prevent spoilage. This was all part of a larger culture of conservation and self-sufficiency that the war demanded. The Victory Garden was a tangible way for a family to contribute to the war effort right in their own backyard. It was a source of food, but also a source of pride. The book A Garden for Victory by Jean-Marie Tatal documents how deeply this movement penetrated American culture with Hollywood as its primary cheerleader. But were there secret agricultural experiments conducted in some of the more secluded studio gardens, testing new types of high-yield crops for military use? Did any of the food produced on studio lots get diverted to feed secret military units or intelligence agents operating out of Hollywood? How much competition was there between the studios to have the most beautiful or productive Victory Garden, and what tricks did they use to get an edge? Or we see the publicity photos, but what did the gardens really look like on a day-to-day basis, and who did the actual back-breaking work? Number 11, how do you sell a war? You sell it like you sell anything else with a good advertising campaign, and the single biggest product the government needed to sell during the war was war bonds. These were essentially loans from citizens to the government. People would buy a bond, and the government would use that money to pay for ships, planes, tanks, and everything else needed to fight. It was a massive fundraising effort. The government raised over $185 billion through the sale of war bonds, with about $45 billion coming from individuals. Hollywood was the engine of the war bond sales machine. The Treasury Department knew that movie stars had an unparalleled ability to draw crowds and open wallets. So they organized a series of Victory Caravan and Stars Over America bond tours. These were like rolling USO shows that traveled across the country by train. At each stop, a group of major stars would put on a show in a stadium or public square. The price of admission was the purchase of a war bond. The scale of these tours was immense. The 1942 Victory Caravan, for example, included stars like Bing Crosby, Bob Hope, Cary Grant, and Claudette Colbert. They traveled for weeks, performing in dozens of cities. The tours were grueling, but the stars understood their importance. They were using their fame for a direct, measurable contribution to the war effort. Hedy Lamarr was a particularly effective bond seller. It's reported she sold $7 million worth of bonds at a single event. She would offer a kiss to anyone who bought $25,000 worth of bonds. The most poignant story is that of actress Carole Lombard. In January 1942, she was on a bond tour in her home state of Indiana. At one event, she raised over $2 million. On her way back to California, the plane she was on crashed and she was killed. Her death was a national tragedy, but it also galvanized the public. It was a stark reminder that the war demanded real sacrifices from everyone, even the most famous. In the wake of her death, bond sales soared. She was posthumously awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Roosevelt. Beyond the tours, stars promoted bonds in every way imaginable. They appeared in short films, on the radio, and in print ads. A popular actress might end a radio interview by saying, "And don't forget to buy war bonds." These constant reminders coming from trusted and admired voices were incredibly persuasive. As documented in works like Selling the War by Robert B. Westbrook, the bond drives were a masterclass in public relations, and Hollywood wrote the script. But what was the real psychological toll on the stars who participated in these relentless high-pressure tours? Did the Treasury Department keep secret rankings of which stars were the most effective bond sellers, leading to a behind-the-scenes competition? Were any of the funds raised in these drives secretly earmarked for classified projects, like the development of new weapons, without the public's knowledge? And what personal stories did people tell the stars as they bought their bonds, stories of sons and daughters overseas that were never recorded? Number 10, was propaganda always obvious? No. The most effective propaganda often doesn't look like propaganda at all. It looks like entertainment. Hollywood feature films made during the war were a primary vehicle for this subtle form of messaging. The Office of War Information OWI understood this well. Rather than creating heavy-handed government films, they chose to work with the existing studio system. The OWI's Bureau of Motion Pictures, led by Lowell Millett, would review scripts and finished films. They didn't have direct censorship power, but they had a lot of influence. The OWI controlled the film export licenses. If a studio wanted to show its movie overseas, which was a huge market, it needed the OWI's approval. This gave the government significant leverage to ensure films reflected the correct message. The OWI's manual for filmmakers laid out several key themes. It asked them to show what America was fighting for: democracy, freedom, who the enemy was depicting them as ruthless and opposed to American values, and the importance of the Allied coalition. The goal was to weave these themes naturally into the stories. A great example is the movie Casablanca, 1942. On the surface, it's a romance and a thriller, but it's also a brilliant piece of propaganda. The main character, Rick, starts as a cynical isolationist saying, "I stick my neck out for nobody." This mirrored America's pre-war isolationist stance. Over the course of the film, he chooses to get involved, sacrificing his own happiness for the greater good of the anti-Axis cause. His personal transformation was a metaphor for the nation's own journey from neutrality to active involvement. The OWI loved the film. Another example is Maris Miniver, 1942. This film, about an ordinary British family coping with the war, had a huge impact on American audiences. It was released before the U.S. entered the war and helped build sympathy for the British cause. It showed the war not as a distant conflict, but as something affecting people just like them. President Roosevelt reportedly was so impressed by the film's power that he ordered it rushed to theaters. Sometimes the OWI's influence was very specific. In the film Action in the North Atlantic, 1943, starring Humphrey Bogart, the OWI asked the studio to include characters from different Allied nations on the ship's crew to emphasize the theme of international cooperation. The studios often complied with these requests because they saw it as their patriotic duty, and it was good for business. The result, as detailed in Hollywood Goes to War, was a filmography that subtly but consistently reinforced the government's message, shaping public opinion without the audience even realizing they were being persuaded. But how many classic films were fundamentally changed from their original script by a quiet suggestion from an O-to-Y official? Were there directors who embedded subtle anti-war or anti-government messages into their films that the censors missed? What happened in the script review meetings between fiery studio heads and determined government officials? And which of our favorite lines of dialogue from wartime movies were actually written not by a screenwriter but by a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C.? Number 9. What happens when a director goes to war? They take their camera with them. During the Second World War, some of Hollywood's most acclaimed directors enlisted and were commissioned to make documentary films for the military. These weren't training films. They were films meant to explain the war to soldiers and the public, to document the reality of the conflict, and to build morale. 5 of these directors are the focus of Mark Harris's book, 5 Came Back: John Ford, William Wyler, John Huston, Frank Capra, and George Stevens. Frank Capra, famous for optimistic films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, was tasked with a monumental project creating the Why We Fight series. This was a series of 7 films designed to explain to American soldiers, many of whom were draftees, why the country was at war. Capra and his team had a problem. They needed to show the enemy's ideology and aggression, but they didn't want to just create standard propaganda. Their solution was ingenious. They decided to use the enemy's own propaganda films against them. They recut and re-narrated footage from enemy sources to expose their ambitions. The series was powerful, persuasive, and mandatory viewing for all recruits. John Ford, a master of the Western, joined the Navy and led a photographic unit. His most famous work from this period is The Battle of Midway, 1942. Ford was on Midway Island during the actual battle and was wounded while filming. He captured stunning, authentic combat footage. The resulting film was so powerful that it won an Academy Award. It gave the American public a real visceral look at what the war was like. William Wyler, known for his polished dramas, focused on the air war. He directed the Memphis Bella Story of a Flying Fortress, 1944. To make the film, Wyler and his crew flew on actual combat missions over Europe. And they captured the danger and teamwork of a bomber crew. One of his cameramen was killed during the filming. The film was a tribute to the bravery of these young airmen and brought the reality of the air war home to America. John Huston made searingly honest films like The Battle of San Pietro and Let There Be Light, which documented the psychological cost of war on soldiers. These directors used their incredible storytelling skills to serve the country. They weren't just recording events, they were shaping them into powerful narratives. They risked their lives to get the footage they needed. They brought a Hollywood level of quality and emotional impact to military filmmaking. Their work stands as some of the most important documentary filmmaking of the 20th century. But what combat footage was deemed too horrific or too demoralizing to be included in the final films, and does that footage still exist? How did these directors, used to having complete control on a movie set, adapt to the chaos and authority of the military? Were there secret missions where directors were sent to film, not for a documentary, but for pure intelligence gathering purposes? And how were their own personalities and psyches changed by the things they witnessed through their camera lenses? And number 8, could an actress be a secret weapon? Yes, and her name was Hedy Lamarr. While most people knew her as one of Hollywood's most beautiful and exotic stars, she was living a secret double life. Lamarr had a brilliant inventive mind. She had been married before the war to a wealthy Austrian munitions dealer. At their dinner parties, she sat and listened quietly as military officials discussed the latest weapons technology. She absorbed it all. When she came to Hollywood and the war began, she wanted to do more than just sell war bonds. She knew that radio-controlled torpedoes were a promising new weapon, but they were easy to jam. An enemy could simply broadcast a strong signal on the same frequency the torpedo was using, and the guidance system would fail. Lamarr came up with a revolutionary idea to solve this problem. Working with her friend, the composer George Antheil, she developed a concept called frequency hopping. The idea was that the radio signal between the control center and the torpedo would jump rapidly between different frequencies in a predetermined synchronized pattern. It would be like a radio dial spinning so fast that an enemy trying to jam it wouldn't know which frequency to block at any given moment. To synchronize the hopping, they used a mechanism based on the player piano rolls that Antheil worked with. It was a brilliant fusion of Hollywood-adjacent technology and military application. They were granted a patent for their secret communication system on August 11th, 1942. They gave the patent to the U.S. Navy, hoping it would be used in the war. However, the Navy was skeptical of an invention from a movie star and a composer and didn't implement the technology at the time. The invention was too far ahead of its time. The story doesn't end there, though. In the late 1950s, engineers rediscovered their patent. The principles of frequency hopping spread spectrum technology, which Hedy Lamarr had co-invented, became the foundation for many modern wireless technologies. It's used today in Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS. While her invention wasn't used to defeat the Axis powers, the brilliant idea born from a Hollywood star's mind during the war laid the groundwork for the digital communication we rely on every day. The story is detailed in the book Hedy's Folly, the Life and Breakthrough Inventions of Hedy Lamarr, the Most Beautiful Woman in the World by Richard Rhodes. But what other technical ideas did Hedy Lamarr come up with that were dismissed and are now lost to history? Were there other Hollywood figures, sound engineers, special effects artists, cinematographers who secretly contributed technical innovations to the war effort that were never patented or publicized? How many military officials were aware of Lamarr's invention during the war, but chose to ignore it out of sheer prejudice? And did she ever use her access to powerful people in Washington to pass along other sensitive technical information she had learned before the war? Number 7, how did they keep the news real? They used Hollywood storytelling techniques. Before television, people got their visual news from the newsreels that played in movie theaters before the main feature. During the war, these short films became a critical source of information and a powerful tool for shaping public opinion. 5 major newsreel companies, Pathé News, Fox Movie Tone News, Hearst Metrotone News, Paramount News, and Universal Newsreel produced 2 issues a week for thousands of theaters. The government recognized the power of the newsreel. The Office of War Information worked closely with the newsreel companies, but it was a complex relationship. The military provided the newsreel companies with official combat footage, but it was heavily censored. The government wanted to show American successes and project an image of strength and confidence. They were very reluctant to show American casualties or the true brutality of combat, fearing it would damage morale. This created a challenge for the newsreel editors. They had to create compelling stories from the footage they were given. They used all the tools of filmmaking to do this. They added dramatic music, authoritative narration, and clever editing to shape the raw footage into a story with heroes and villains. A report from the Bureau of Motion Pictures in 1943 stated that over 100 million people saw newsreels each week. This gave them an immense influence over how the public perceived the war. The newsreels covered everything. They showed battles in the Pacific, bombing runs over Europe, and the production of tanks on the home front. They profiled individual heroes and showed the launching of new ships. For many Americans, the images they saw in the newsreels were the war. As the war went on, however, there was a debate within the government about the level of censorship. Some officials, including journalist Elmer Davis, who headed the OWI, argued that the public needed to see a more realistic depiction of the war to understand the sacrifices being made. In 1943, the government finally released footage showing dead American soldiers for the first time from the Battle of Bunagona. The decision was controversial, but it marked a shift towards greater realism. The newsreels were a curated propagandistic view of the war, but they were also the public's only window into a global conflict. But how much crucial combat footage captured by brave cameramen was confiscated by military censors and never seen again? Were there rivalries between the newsreel companies, leading them to stage events or use deceptive editing to get a more exciting story? How many newsreel narrators privately disagreed with the optimistic, government-approved scripts they were reading? And what subtle details in the background of newsreel shots missed by censors might offer a different, truer story of the war? Number 6, what is the price of a laugh for a soldier? For the entertainers who travel to the front lines, the price could be exhaustion, illness, and constant danger. The United Service Organizations, or USO, was founded in 1941 to provide recreation and entertainment for American troops. The most famous part of the USO's work was the camp shows. These were live performances that brought a taste of home to soldiers stationed in remote and often dangerous locations. Hollywood was the heart of the USO camp shows. The industry's biggest stars volunteered to travel overseas and perform for the troops, often just a few miles from the front lines. The logistics were staggering. The USO sent more than 7,000 entertainers overseas who put on over 400,000 performances for more than 160 million service members. The undisputed king of the USO was Bob Hope. He spent years traveling tirelessly from one military base to another, from the deserts of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific. His shows, which featured a mix of comedy, music, and beautiful actresses, were a huge boost to morale. He had a unique ability to connect with the soldiers, tailoring his jokes to their specific location and experiences. He became a symbol of home, a friendly face in the middle of a war zone. His dedication is legendary. He spent nearly every Christmas during the war with the troops. But it wasn't just Hope. Scores of other stars made the journey. Marlene Dietrich toured extensively, often performing in rugged conditions very close to the fighting. The Andrews sisters, Bing Crosby and Jack Benny, were just a few of the many who dedicated their time. These tours were not glamorous. The stars dealt with primitive living conditions, bad food, exhausting travel schedules, and the constant risk of enemy attack. They saw the cost of war up close. They visited wounded soldiers in hospitals and saw the fatigue and fear in the eyes of the men they were there to entertain. The impact of these shows cannot be overstated. For a soldier who had been through the trauma of combat, a few moments of laughter or a familiar song could be a powerful medicine. It was a reminder that they were not forgotten, that the people back home cared about them. As one soldier wrote in a letter home, documented in Paulie Zigo's book, The Hollywood Canteen, seeing a live show from a famous star was like a letter from home for everybody. It was a brief, joyful escape from the grim reality of war. But what were the conversations like between the stars and the soldiers after the shows were over, when the cameras were off? How many stars suffered from what we would now call PTSD as a result of the things they witnessed on these tours? Were there any USO tours that were secretly a cover for intelligence operations, with an entertainer acting as a courier or a spy? And what happened to the thousands of gifts and trinkets given to the stars by grateful soldiers, each one with a story now lost? Number 5, could a cartoon character be a tax collector? Yes, and he did it with a smile. In 1942, the American tax system underwent a massive change. The Revenue Act of 1942 greatly increased the number of people who had to pay federal income tax. Before the war, only a small percentage of high-income Americans paid. Suddenly, millions of middle and lower-income citizens were required to file and pay for the first time. The government needed a way to explain this new reality and convince people that paying taxes was their patriotic duty. The Treasury Department turned to Walt Disney. They commissioned a short animated film to get the message out. The result was The New Spirit, 1942, starring Donald Duck. In the film, a patriotic radio announcer explains to a reluctant Donald why it's important to pay his income tax. The film walks him and the audience through the process of filling out the simplified tax form. It frames tax payment not as a burden, but as a vital contribution to the war effort. The film's slogan was "Taxes to Beat the Axis." The film was a huge success. It was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary Short. More importantly, it was seen by an estimated 26 million people in movie theaters. It was a brilliant piece of public relations. It used a beloved character to deliver a piece of information that might otherwise have been confusing or unwelcome. A poll conducted by Gallup after the film's release found that 37% of people said the film had made them more willing to pay their taxes. The collaboration was so successful that a sequel, The Spirit of 43, was released the following year. This film featured Donald Duck being tempted by a spendthrift character and a thrifty, patriotic character. The film encouraged people to save their money to pay taxes and buy war bonds. This use of animation for public service was a new idea. It showed that the same medium that could tell fairy tales could also be used for civic education. The Disney Studio's ability to simplify complex information and present it in an entertaining way was a powerful tool for the government. They took a dry, bureaucratic topic and made it feel accessible and important. It was another example of how every part of the Hollywood machine, right down to the ink and paint department, was enlisted in the war effort. But what was the private reaction of Walt Disney, a fiscal conservative, to being asked to create a film encouraging higher taxes? Were there other animated characters from different studios who were considered for the role of tax promoter before they settled on Donald Duck? How many people actually used the film as a guide to fill out their first tax return? And were there any versions of the film made for international distribution to encourage citizens of allied nations to support their own tax systems? Number 4. What did screenwriters do besides write screenplays? Some of them became intelligence analysts. The Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, was the precursor to the modern CIA. It was America's primary intelligence agency during the war. One of its many challenges was understanding the enemy's mindset, motivations, and morale. To do this, they needed to analyze enemy propaganda. And who better to analyze films and scripts than the people who made them for a living? The OSS actively recruited Hollywood screenwriters, directors, and producers. These individuals had a unique set of skills. They knew how to analyze a story for its underlying themes, messages, and emotional appeals. They could watch an enemy propaganda film and deconstruct it, identifying what it was trying to make its audience feel and believe. This was a new kind of intelligence analysis focusing on psychology and culture. The head of the OSS, William Bill Donovan, established a branch in Los Angeles to tap into this talent pool. Screenwriters would be given enemy films, radio transcripts, and censored mail to analyze. They would write detailed reports on the themes they observed. For example, if enemy newsreels started focusing more on defensive weapons than offensive ones, it might signal a shift in their strategic thinking or a decline in their morale. If their feature films started emphasizing glorious sacrifice over heroic victory, it might suggest they were preparing their population for a long, difficult struggle. This was vital information for American military planners and propagandists. By understanding the enemy's narrative, the OSS could craft more effective counter-propaganda. They could create leaflets and radio broadcasts that targeted the specific hopes and fears of the enemy population. According to the book Cloak and Gown Scholars in the Secret War, 1939 to 1961 by Robin W. Winks, this analysis of morale was a key part of the OSS's work. This relationship also went the other way. The OSS sometimes used Hollywood as a cover for its operations. An OSS agent might travel overseas under the guise of being a location scout for a movie. The film industry provided a plausible reason for Americans to be in exotic or sensitive locations. It was a world of illusion, and the OSS used that to its advantage. The line between making movies and gathering intelligence was, for some, non-existent. But what specific intelligence breakthrough came from a screenwriter noticing a tiny, overlooked detail in an enemy propaganda film? How many famous screenwriters led double lives as OSS agents, a secret they took to their graves? Were there secret OSS training facilities hidden on Hollywood backlots where agents learned tradecraft from stage magicians and special effects artists? And what happened to the top secret reports written by these screenwriters, and what insights might they still hold? Number 3, how did the government talk to Hollywood? It published a manual. As we've touched on, the relationship between the government and the film industry was crucial, but it needed to be managed. The Office of War Information, OWI, was the main point of contact. To streamline the process and make its goals clear, the OWI's Bureau of Motion Pictures created a remarkable document, the Government Information Manual for the Motion Picture Industry. This manual was sent to studio heads, producers, and screenwriters. It wasn't a list of censorship rules. It was a guide, a list of suggestions and themes that the government believed would help the war effort. It was a surprisingly sophisticated document. It didn't just say make patriotic movies. It broke down the war into a series of key questions and ideas. The manual asked filmmakers to consider 7 questions whenever they made a film. 1. Will this picture help win the war? The manual then went into great detail about the major themes the government wanted to see. It talked about the issues of the war, the nature of the enemy, the United Nations, the Allies, the home front, and the production front. For each topic, it offered specific story ideas and angles. For example, it might suggest a film about the challenges and triumphs of a multi-ethnic bomber crew to promote national unity. Or it might suggest a story that highlights the contribution of an allied country like China or Russia to foster international cooperation. This manual, explored in detail by Clayton R. Capes and Gregory D. Black, is a fascinating look at how propaganda was systematized. The OWA understood that the best way to get its message across was to collaborate with Hollywood storytellers, not to command them. The manual gave filmmakers a framework. It allowed them to be creative while still serving the national interest. It was a partnership, and this document was its operating agreement. But what early drafts of the manual contained suggestions that were deemed too heavy-handed or controversial and were later removed. Were there secret addendums to the manual that were only given to trusted studio heads, containing more sensitive or classified requests? How many screenwriters use the manual as a checklist, cynically inserting patriotic themes simply to get their scripts approved? And what would a similar manual written for today's media landscape look like? Number 2, did any stars do more than perform? Yes, many of them put on a real uniform. The most direct and powerful contribution a Hollywood star could make to the war effort was to enlist. And many of the biggest male stars did just that. This was a huge personal sacrifice. They were at the peak of their careers, making vast sums of money. They chose to trade that for the life of an ordinary soldier, sailor, or airman. Their enlistment had a massive symbolic impact. It sent a clear message to the American public: this war involves everyone. If a major star like Clark Gable or James Stewart was willing to serve, then no one was exempt from doing their part. It was a powerful counter to any notion that the war was something for other people's sons to fight. James Stewart was one of the first major stars to enlist. He was already a licensed pilot. He joined the Army Air Forces in March 1941, even before the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was initially rejected for being underweight, but worked hard to meet the requirement. He didn't want a safe job behind a desk. He insisted on combat duty. He flew 20 combat missions as a bomber pilot over Europe, rising from private to colonel. He was a genuine war hero. Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood, was devastated by the death of his wife, Carol Lombard, on her war bond tour. He decided to enlist in the Army Air Forces at the age of 41. He trained as an aerial gunner and flew 5 combat missions, earning the Air Medal. The German regime's leader reportedly held a personal animosity towards Gable and offered a reward for his capture. The list goes on. Henry Fonda served in the Navy in the Pacific and earned a Bronze Star. Tyrone Power was a Marine Corps pilot. David Niven served in the British Army. These were not publicity stunts. These men served in dangerous roles, and their studios and fans had to live with the real possibility that they might not come back. Their service was an inspiration. It was a constant reminder in every newspaper and magazine of the stakes of the war. It embodied the idea of shared sacrifice in the most literal way possible. But what were the unrecorded acts of bravery performed by these stars, witnessed only by their fellow soldiers? Did any of them use their celebrity status to cut through military red tape and save the lives of men under their command? How did the presence of a famous movie star affect the morale and discipline of a military unit, for better or for worse? And what were the candid conversations like in the quiet moments in a barracks or on a ship between a world-famous actor and an 18-year-old private from a small town? Number 1, what is the first thing you need to win a war? You need a story. You need a reason. Before you can mobilize an army or a factory, you need to mobilize the will of the people. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, America was a deeply isolationist country. Many people did not want to get involved in another European war. The entertainment industry, however, saw the growing threat from the Axis powers and began to sound the alarm. They started making films that were subtly and then overtly anti-Axis and pro-Allies long before the government was officially involved. As early as 1939, Warner Bros. Released Confessions of a Spy. The film was a fictionalized account of an FBI agent infiltrating an enemy spy ring in the United States. It was one of the first major studio films to directly portray the German regime as a threat to America. This was a bold move at a time when the U.S. was officially neutral. The German government officially protested the film. Other films followed. The Mortal Storm 1940 from MGM depicted the devastating impact of the regime's rise on one German family. It didn't need to show battlefields to show the evil of the ideology. Foreign Correspondent 1940, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, was a thrilling spy story that ended with an American journalist broadcasting from a bombed-out London, making a passionate plea for America to wake up to the danger. Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, 1940, was a brilliant and courageous satire that mercilessly mocked the enemy leader. Chaplin funded the film himself because studios were too afraid to make it. These films were acts of political courage. They were made by producers, writers, and directors, many of whom were immigrants or had family in Europe and understood the threat firsthand. They faced criticism from isolationist groups in America and risked boycotts, but they believed it was their responsibility to warn the country. 1941, before Pearl Harbor, a Senate subcommittee investigated Hollywood, accusing the industry of producing warmongering propaganda to drag the U.S. into the conflict. The hearings were a major political battle. These early films were Hollywood's first, and perhaps most important, contribution. They helped to mentally and emotionally prepare the American people for the war that was to come. They framed the conflict not as a distant foreign problem, but as a moral struggle for the future of freedom and democracy. They told the story that the nation needed to hear. They helped to build the public consensus and political will that would be necessary to fight and win the most destructive war in human history. But what was the full extent of the pressure and threats faced by the creators of these early anti-Axis films from isolationist groups? Were there any scripts for even more powerful and direct films that were shelved because the studio heads were too afraid to make them? How many minds were truly changed by these movies, shifting a voter from an isolationist to an interventionist stance? And what if these films had never been made? How different would the American public's response to the war have been?